Welcome to Coast Vue, the show that every single day celebrates the men and women who are making coastal Mississippi, and Mississippi, for that matter, such a great place to live, work, and play. You know, one of the things I say on my show a lot is that you never know what someone is going through. You just never know what someone is going through. We talk about it as it relates to social media a lot, that people are willing to say things on social media they would never say to someone if they had to look at them in the face. But you never know what someone's going through. I think a lot more about that recently. I'm really lucky to have my mother still. She's 88 years old, and I didn't talk about this because she's very private and would kill me for even mentioning this now. But she had her aortic valve replaced last December at the age of 88. And tough recovery, was doing really, really well. And then some complications over the last few days have cropped up related to the valve. And she's dealing with that now. But you know, I think about it, so many people who go through things like that, and you just never know. And I thought about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow once said this: "Every man has a secret sorrows which the world knows not, and sometimes we call a man cold when he is only sad." That's something I think we should all think about. I have another one that I want to share with you too. It's from Morgan Harper Nichols, and talks about empathy. And I think we should all think twice about this. So here's what he said about empathy. "Let me hold the door for you. I may have never walked a mile in your shoes, but I can see that your soles are worn and your strength is torn under the weight of a story I've never lived before. So let me hold the door for you. After all you've walked through, it's the least I can do." I wish we would all sort of take a step back with each other more frequently and recognize that we never really know for sure what people are going through. And someone who kind of knows that well, you know, even though we talk about Saints and sports and Pelicans and whatever, my friend Jeff Duncan, who is a columnist at NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune, who's with me every single Friday, is writing Steve Gleason's book now. We've talked about it just about weekly since then. But Jeff, good morning to you, my friend. How you doing, first of all?
Yeah, I'm doing good, Ricky. Nice subject matter. I like that.
Yeah, well, look, you've learned a lot about empathy in the past year or so. Well, you listen. I remember when I was president of NOLA Media Group, you and I had long conversations about the possibility that you might write a book about Steve Gleason one day, and because you had this long association, you really sort of chronicled his whole sort of journey from the very beginning, developed a good relationship with him and his wife, and now you're writing his book, working with one of the top publishers in the United States. But man, you're learning some lessons about life. I love the conversations we have on the air. I even enjoy more the conversations we have off the air about how writing that book has changed you. But you know, we don't have enough empathy for our fellow man, do we, buddy?
No, I think that's a good lesson for all of us in this kind of trying times that we're in over here in New Orleans. I think about it a lot because it's been a frustrating time politically, and crime's up and all the things we go through. You know, you look for reasons to have hope and beacons of light. And I'm fortunate to get to work with Steve and Michelle daily on this book project, and it definitely puts things in perspective of you know, what life's precarious nature and how we should all appreciate every day that we have here. And it's sometimes you can get that perspective lost in the world we live in.
We can. Speaking of crime, incidentally, I've gotten several notes from listeners who are deeply concerned. You and I talked about this before, but the shootings on I-10 in East New Orleans East. Recently, a family was shot at and injured on their way to a water park in Alabama. I mean, I don't even know what to say to people of coastal Mississippi about, you know, their concern about that. But, you know, it's not just there. It's just in general, there's a problem. And if you were to read NOLA.com on a regular basis, your team is doing an extraordinary job of trying to tell that story and what we need to do about it. There's a lot of struggles within the mayor's office. I mean, it's got to be terribly frustrating to be in the city and to hear these concerns being expressed nationally.
Yeah, and it's funny. I've talked about it before. I've lived in New Orleans now for 23, going on 24 years, and to some degree, I feel like I'm in a bubble. I mean, I've never really experienced any crime here, at all in my 24 years. I've lived uptown the whole time, in the city. And so, sometimes it's hard for us to relate because we live in this cocoon, and then you read the daily headlines, of course, on my website. And, I have friends that come in from out of town that ask me about it. And I think it's a very complicated situation. A lot of times there's a lot of targeted crime here that occurs in certain areas of town that, if you just avoid those areas, you're going to be fine. So it's hard to explain to people the crime problem. The one thing I would say about it is it didn't start yesterday. I mean, this thing's been going on in New Orleans for decades, long before you and I got here. And I don't really blame the mayor's office. I think it's way beyond even the New Orleans Police Department. I think it's societal and systemic, and I'm not sure anybody can truly solve it.
Yeah. I think you and I have talked about it before, but I spent a lot of time with Mitch Landrieu when I was president of NOLA Media Group talking about the challenge. And you're right, it's a generational solution. Over 50% of African-American men in the city are unemployed. I'm sure that's actually higher than that now just because of the pandemic and just other challenges. But you've got generational issues there. When you think about gangs, for example, gangs are different now. Gangs are more neighborhood related. They're younger. They have, if you such thing as having more deadly weapons, they certainly have them now. And as Mitch Landrieu told me on a number of occasions, a lot of these young men are just scared to death, and they don't expect to live to tomorrow. And they're making decisions based on how can I survive today. And a lot of the shootings, incidentally, you're right about this, targeted shootings where you've got a sort of rival people getting together, shooting at each other on I-10, for example. People get caught in the crossfire. We don't know the situation as it relates to this family that was headed to Alabama. We don't know what the situation is there. We're still waiting to hear more about that. I actually checked this morning, for a matter of fact, to see if there was any new information there, and nothing new has been reported, at least that I could see on the internet. But it's a tough one. It's a really tough one. And how do you advise someone who, Mississippians are using I-10 every single day. I mean, some are coming there to work. A lot of them are going there to go to the airport. A lot of them have places in the French Quarter, and they love it there. And I love the city. I mean, obviously, I spent a lot of time there. My experience there was exactly like your experience there. I never personally experienced any crime, but it's a tough one. It's a tough one. Hopefully, I need to talk to some people on your team to figure out who I need to get from the NOLA.com team to have a conversation about it, so that we can at least inform people here in coastal Mississippi about the situation. So it's not a general concern, but they can hear more specifically about, what the situation is. Anything else on that point before we shift gears?
No, look, I would say one thing, we've talked about it on the show before. There's a book out by a colleague of mine named Kent Babb, and it's really a football book. It's called Across the River, but it's written on a much bigger prism, much bigger scale about living in New Orleans. And it's about the Carr High School football program, which is enormously successful, coached by Bryce Brown. And I would recommend reading that because he gets deep into these societal issues about what goes on in New Orleans neighborhoods and the gang culture and the crime issues. And it really gives you a good understanding of it. That it just goes so deep into some of these communities and beyond, I think, just normal, criminal justice. I think there's societal issues and like family issues. I would recommend reading that book because I think it'd give you a better understanding of what some of these kids are faced with when they grow up in this culture.
For sure. Tough conversation, complicated conversation. It's unfortunately when people read the headlines, they they're concerned about it. And, I don't blame them. I don't blame them. Whether you live in coastal Mississippi or whether you live in New Orleans or the region, people should be concerned. And hopefully one day we have leadership across this nation who can start to address it in sort of the generational way it's going to have to be addressed. Okay, so anyway, let's shift gears. Man, I tell you what, I didn't realize we were at the end of this segment, but when we come back on the other side, we're going to talk about the New Orleans Pelicans and the way they sadly flamed out, because there was a lot of hope this season. Jeff, I know you're concerned about it. We'll talk more about that on the other side when we continue our conversation with Jeff Duncan. Welcome back to Coast Vue. I'm my friend Jeff Duncan from NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune. And it occurred to me, Jeff, that that's kind of a somber conversation around crime and empathy, and you never know what someone's going to go through. I apologize to Coast Vue listeners who come here to hear uplifting messages. And I think to some extent, when we talk about empathy, that is an uplifting message, and hopefully people see that and don't see it as just a somber message. Unfortunately, the conversation around the Pelicans is somber, but maybe the better definition is troubling. I don't know. But what's your thoughts and where are you headed with how you're going to talk about it?
Well, look, I just think it's really fans here are really frustrated. A very disappointing season. I mean, the start of the year in January, the team was up near the top 3 in the Western Conference. Looked like they were going to make the playoffs, and there was a lot of excitement and optimism. This was going to be the year where things got back on track, and then series of injuries, of course, to Zion Williamson and Brandon Ingram, their 2 star players, and they never really got back on track. Ingram did finally. But I think the disappointment in having hopes raised again and then to be let down and then to lose at home like they did last night let's face it, the Oklahoma City Thunder, they started this season as a franchise that was supposed to be in transition and rebuilding. They were predicted to be one of the worst teams in the league, and they overachieved. And for them to come into New Orleans, even without Zion Williamson and some of the bench players that were hurt, that's a disappointing loss for the organization. There's no other way around it. You had a sellout crowd there. You had a 6-point lead at halftime, and then you lost it in the second half. So I don't think you can sugarcoat it, Ricky. I mean, they've got some big decisions to make this offseason. 4 years in a row now, this team hasn't finished above 9th in the Western Conference standings. And, at some point, you can't sell hope. You got to start delivering on the product.
Well, last week you thought that Zion might be back for the game. And then right after that, you saw this weird kind of message from the front office about his situation. Well, what's your read on that? Just basically wasn't ready?
I don't think he's in shape. I think it's plain and simple. I mean, there's a lot of bad messaging coming out, and that's part of the problem is, fans want to hear from him, and then when they hear from him, they don't like what they hear. I mean, basically, he's not in game shape. So his hamstring's fine, but from the organization's point of view, they don't want to put him out there if he's overweight and, run the risk of re-injuring himself. So I think it's a very complicated situation. He's got to get more serious about his injury history and his rehab. I think that's the clear message. If you read between the lines what C.J. McCollum said last night afterward, he talked about very veiled, but I think it was clearly pointed at Zion Williamson, where, we got to make sure we're hydrated. We got to make sure we're, doing all the things you need to do when you're a professional athlete. Get your priorities in line so you can get back and help the team. I think that's the message. And this is what you deal with sometimes when you have young athletes. I mean, guys in their early 20s making a lot of money. And, when they get injured, I think trying to get back on the court should be the top priority. And sometimes it's not.
So, Jeff, do you think they got the right front office, the right coach? What's going on?
Well, I think those guys are kind of powerless to some degree. They've got to somehow get the message across and hold some of these players accountable. But I think the players have to hold themselves accountable more than that. Sometimes it comes down to, just internal character and where are your priorities. And that can be difficult when you're young and you're making $30-40 million a year and you're injured. You keep having these injuries. But I think that the key thing for, I think, Pelicans, Saints ownership management to understand, because they're one and the same to some degree, is that it's not just one player. It's not just Zion. I mean, Brandon Ingram's had this injury history. Michael Thomas has had these injury histories. And we're talking about multiple star players, multiple misleading diagnoses, multiple different injuries. And at some point, people get frustrated. And I think that's what the fan base right now, I'm hearing from them right in the city.
Yeah, both teams. You're right. You're right. I mean, it's a too familiar a refrain, and hopefully we can get past it, because it seems like in both cases we're just one or two players or one or two injuries, not having those injuries, away from having really good teams on both accounts, aren't we?
Well, you know what, but that's, in my opinion, kind of the loser's lament. I mean, that's what you hear from losing franchises. That's the dice game that you play with semantics. That, frankly, that's why I respected Sean Payton so much when he was the leader here. He never allowed injuries to be an excuse, a crutch for his team, for his players. He refused to make excuses. And you hear a lot of excuses right now from the Saints-Pelicans group, leaning on these injuries. And everyone's got injuries. I mean, Oklahoma City is a good example. Their number one draft pick, their first-round pick in the top 5, I mean, he hurt his leg and was out the entire year, didn't play all year. And they still came in here and won with a younger roster, much younger than the Pelicans, on their home court at a sellout crowd. So, I mean, you can make excuses, but at some point you got to, the proof's in the pudding.
I'm reminded why you're such a good columnist. A loser's lament, a dice game with semantics. Is that how you said it?
Yeah. I just feel like I've heard too much of it. And I think that's the issue with the fans right now. It's just constantly hearing, when you read my column this weekend, I think it'll hit home, because it's not one thing. It's a bunch of things that have added up, and it's the same kind of, semantics that people are being led to believe. And at some point, people stop believing what you're telling them or selling them. One of those two.
Yeah. Okay. So we're barreling toward the draft. You continue to see all these mock drafts. A lot of, Saints have a real opportunity here to pick up some good players. Most of the drafts I look like show some really, your whole notion of pick the best player available. There's going to be some good players available, both in the first and second round, based on all the mock drafts I'm taking a look at.
Yeah, I think the Saints will be aggressive like they always are. They've got 8 draft picks. I don't think they'll use all 8 of them. I think they'll make a move like they tend to do. They tend to target players they really like and go get them. And I think that's served them well over the years. They're not worried about quantity. They're worried about quality in the draft, getting players they know can make a difference. And I expect them to come out of this draft in one of their first or couple picks with an offensive playmaker, whether that's a running back, a tight end, a receiver. I think they're going to get someone to add some firepower to the offense. I think that's very much needed. And then you and I have talked about it on the show. They've got to get an interior defensive lineman, I think a young run stopper, someone that can maybe provide some pass rush. That's a big weakness right now for the Saints. I think those two aspects, interior defensive line and an offensive playmaker, whatever form they come in, I think those aspects have to be added in this draft.
Yeah, you've said before in past shows that typically running backs aren't going high in the draft like used to see. But as a result of that, you look at some of the talent that's going to be available. There's really some good talent out there. There's some playmakers that are probably going to be available to the Saints, depending on what defensive players are available at the time that these offensive players are available. They're going to have some tough choices to make, aren't they?
Yeah, look, I think the way you look at it is, say they're at 29 and, once they start getting into the 20s of the draft, if they have a tight end or a back or a receiver, like I said, that they've got graded in the top 15 players overall in the whole draft and they're still there, that's when I think they make a move and go up and get him. That's how they operate, is if they have a grade on a player and the value is so great, you can justify going to make a trade. I think that's the kind of move that they'll make, because I don't think they're going to have 8 players make this roster. So there's no reason to draft 8 players if you don't think 8 of them are good enough to make your team. So you use those picks as almost trade assets to move around and target the players you want.
Hey, Juan, we talked about it a little bit last week, your most recent column about it. Saints have done a really good job in the undrafted free agent arena, and it will be interesting to watch Ireland play some of his magic again as we not only target during the draft some opportunities that maybe others aren't really thinking about, but then once the draft's over, they'll be making some moves again, and they've just really played well in that arena, haven't they?
Well, you could make this argument, Ricky, that the 3 best offensive playmakers last year, Taysom Hill, Rashim Shaheed, and Juwan Johnson, they were all undrafted players. And so, you can find really good players that fall through the cracks. And might be a player after the draft that the Saints view as a draftable player. They might have a high grade on him, 5th-round grade, and he didn't even get drafted. So it's almost like getting extra draft picks in the Saints' mind.
Pretty amazing stuff. Be interesting as we barrel toward the draft to see all this kind of play out. But anyway, it's been great to check in with you, my friend. I really enjoy our conversations every Friday.
Yeah, thanks, Ricky. Everybody have a great weekend. We'll talk next week, buddy.
You for sure. Hey, when we come back, we're going to talk about the Lynn Meadows Discovery Center and a really important event they have coming up. We'll see you after this.